power is a dangerous game, especially when played against the wrong opponent. A ruthless billionaire thought he could buy an entire restaurant just to humiliate and fire a waitress who bruised his fragile ego. He didn't know she held the deed to the very bank, keeping his empire afloat. The ambient lighting inside Lorcaday Manhattan's most fiercely guarded culinary secret cast a warm golden hue over the dining room. It was a Tuesday evening, but the tables were packed with the city's elite hedge fund managers, tech executives, and old money socialites. Navigating the floor with practiced grace was Abigail Fisher. Dressed in the crisp-tailored uniform of the waitstaff, she moved seamlessly between the linen-draped tables. Abigail was exceptional at her job. She was observant, anticipating the needs of her guests before they even voiced them, and maintained an air of dignified professionalism that demanded respect. In the center of the room sat Conrad Hayes. Conrad was a real estate tycoon whose face frequently graced the covers of financial magazines, often accompanied by headlines praising his aggressive acquisition tactics. Behind closed doors, however, Conrad was known for something else, entirely a volcanic temper, and an insatiable need to dominate every room he entered. His empire, Hayes International, was vast but heavily leveraged. He built his skyscrapers on mountains of debt, a precarious house of cards that required constant aggressive expansion to remain standing. That night, Conrad was entertaining a group of potential investors from London. He was already 3 martinis deep and loud enough to turn heads at adjacent tables. The incident began over something utterly trivial. Tommy, a 19-year-old busboy working his second week at the restaurant, was clearing the appetizer plates. Nervous and intimidated by Conrad's booming voice, Tommy's hand slipped. A single errant drop of condensation from a water glass fell, landing squarely on the cuff of Conrad's custom-tailored Brioni suit jacket. Silence slammed down on the table. Conrad stared at the tiny, damp spot on his sleeve, his face darkening to a dangerous shade of crimson. "You clumsy, incompetent idiot!" Conrad snarled, his voice carrying across the hushed dining room. He stood up, towering over the terrified teenager. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs? It's worth more than your entire miserable life," Tommy stammered, apologizing profusely, his hands shaking as he offered a pristine white napkin. Conrad slapped the napkin away. "Get the manager, now." Before Henry, the deeply protective general manager, could cross the floor, Abigail intervened. She stepped smoothly between the furious billionaire and the trembling busboy, her posture perfectly straight. "Mr. Hayes." Abigail said, her voice calm, modulated, and entirely devoid of fear. "Please accept my deepest apologies on behalf of the restaurant. We will of course cover the cost of dry cleaning. I have arranged for a complimentary bottle of the 2012 vintage you were eyeing earlier to be brought to your table immediately." Conrad glared down at her. He wasn't used to people looking him in the eye when he was angry. He was used to cowering to frantic apologies, to absolute submission. Abigail offered none of those. "I don't want your apologies, and I don't want your wine," Conrad spat. "I want this boy fired, right now, in front of me." "I am afraid I cannot do that, sir," Abigail replied evenly. "Tommy made an honest mistake. He is learning. We do not terminate staff over a drop of water." "You don't?" Conrad leaned in his breath, smelling of gin and malice. "And who the hell are you to tell me what happens here?" "You're a waitress. You carry plates. Fetch your manager before I have you thrown out on the street with him." Henry finally arrived, breathless. "Mr. Hayes, is there a problem?" "Yes, Henri," Conrad barked, jabbing a finger at Abigail. "Your waitress here just decided to tell me how to run a business. Fire the boy and fire her, immediately, or I swear to God I will make sure this establishment is ruined." Henri, a man who had spent 30 years building L'Orchidée's reputation, looked at Abigail, then at Conrad. He sighed. "Mr. Hayes, Abigail is one of my finest staff members, and Tommy is a trainee. I apologize for the inconvenience, but I will not terminate them." Conrad's eyes widened in genuine shock. His ego, fragile and monstrous, had been bruised in front of his international investors. He slowly buttoned his jacket, a cold, venomous smile spreading across his face. "Fine," Conrad whispered, though the entire room could hear him. "You want to protect a waitress? You want to play games with me? I'm going to buy this pathetic little restaurant, Henri, and the very first thing I do as the new owner will be to personally strip this girl of her apron and throw her out the back door." Conrad threw a $100 bill onto the table and stormed out his investors, trailing awkwardly behind him. The dining room exhaled a collective breath. Henri turned to Abigail, rubbing his temples. "He is a vindictive man, Abigail. He has the money to do it." "He has debt, Henri," Abigail corrected, softly picking up the $100 bill. "Not money. There is a very distinct difference." Over the next 4 weeks, the atmosphere at L'Orchidée grew tense. True to his word, Conrad Hayes mobilized his aggressive legal team. He approached the aging owner of the restaurant, a retired chef living in Provence, with an offer that was aggressively over market value. It was an offer designed to be impossible to refuse. The owner, unaware of the petty vendetta driving the sale, signed the papers. During this time, Abigail continued to work her shifts flawlessly. She didn't look for another job. She didn't panic. But during her breaks, standing in the cold alleyway behind the kitchen, she wasn't smoking or scrolling through her phone like the other staff. She was making highly encrypted phone calls. She spoke in low, rapid tones about mezzanine financing, debt-to-equity ratios, and covenant breaches. Because Abigail Fisher was not just a waitress, she was the sole heir to the Fisher banking dynasty. Her late grandfather, a titan of Wall Street, had left her a controlling interest in the First Liberty Continental Bank, one of the largest institutional lenders in North America. Abigail had chosen to work anonymously in the service industry, to ground herself a self-imposed requirement before she officially took her seat as the chairwoman of the board. Conrad Hayes didn't know it, but in his desperate rush to secure the capital to buy the restaurant, he had leveraged his latest real estate project through First Liberty Continental. He had walked right into the lion's den, completely blind to the fact that the waitress he was trying to crush owned the teeth. The transition of ownership was brutal and swift. Conrad Hayes wanted a spectacle. He wanted his victory to be public, humiliating, and absolute. He chose a Friday night, the busiest shift of the week, to make his grand entrance. At 7:30 p.m., the mahogany double doors of L'Orchidée swung open. Conrad strode in, flanked by 2 sharp-suited lawyers and his personal assistant. He wore a triumphant smirk, looking around the bustling dining room like a conquering emperor surveying his newly acquired territory. He didn't wait for a hostess. He marched directly to the center of the floor and loudly clapped his hands together. "Ladies and gentlemen, staff of L'Orchidée, may I have your attention?" The clinking of crystal and the low hum of conversation ground to a halt. Diners paused with their forks suspended in mid-air. Henri, the manager, emerged from the kitchen, his face pale. "As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, Hayes International is the sole proprietor of this establishment," Conrad announced, his voice booming with theatrical arrogance. "There will be immediate restructuring, and that begins right now." His predatory gaze swept the room until it locked onto Abigail. She was standing near the sommelier station, holding a polished silver tray. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. "You." Conrad pointed a manicured finger directly at her. "Waitress, come here." The room was dead silent. Every eye was on Abigail as she calmly set down the silver tray, smoothed the front of her black apron, and walked with measured, deliberate steps toward the billionaire. "I told you I'd be back," Conrad sneered, lowering his voice just enough so only the surrounding tables could hear the venom in it. "I told you I would buy this place just to fire you, so take off the apron, clear out your locker. You are officially terminated." Abigail stopped a few feet away from him. She reached behind her back, untied the knot of her apron, and folded it neatly over her arm. But to Conrad's growing irritation, she didn't look defeated. There were no tears, no apologies, no begging for her livelihood. Instead, the corner of her mouth twitched into a small, chillingly confident smile. "I accept my termination, Mr. Hayes," Abigail said, her voice echoing perfectly in the quiet room. "However, since you are so eager to discuss business and restructuring in a public forum, I suppose it is only fair that we discuss yours." Conrad frowned, his thick brows knitting together. "What are you talking about? Girl, get out of my restaurant." "It is your restaurant, yes," Abigail agreed, reaching into the pocket of her tailored slacks. She pulled out a sleek black smartphone. "You acquired it for $12.5 million, a steep price. To fund this petty revenge, your shell company, Hayes Capital, took out a short-term, high-interest mezzanine loan." Conrad's arrogant smirk faltered slightly. He shot a confused, angry glance at his lawyers. "How do you know about that security? Get this woman out of here." "You borrowed that money from First Liberty Continental." Abigail continued, smoothly ignoring his outburst. She tapped the screen of her phone. "A massive risk, considering your flagship development in Hudson Yards is already heavily over-leveraged with the exact same bank. Your debt-to-equity ratio is currently sitting at a catastrophic 92%. "Who the hell are you?" Conrad demanded, his voice losing its booming confidence, replaced by a sharp edge of genuine panic. "How do you have my financial data?" "My name is Abigail Fisher," she said, her voice ringing with undeniable authority. "My late grandfather was Theodore Fisher, and as of my board confirmation at 9 o'clock this morning, I am the majority shareholder and chairwoman of First Liberty Continental Bank." A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. Henry dropped his clipboard. Conrad's lawyers turned ashen. Conrad took a step back, the color draining from his face. "Fisher, you're the Fisher heiress." "That's impossible. You're a waitress. You serve bread." "I serve bread to understand the people who actually run this city," Abigail replied coldly. "While you were busy fast-tracking a loan to buy a restaurant just to satisfy your pathetic ego, my risk assessment team was busy auditing your entire portfolio." She stepped closer to him, her presence suddenly commanding the entire room. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a titan. "Your loans with First Liberty Continental contain a standard cross-default clause and a strict debt covenant agreement. By taking out an additional $12 million without prior board approval to buy this restaurant, you breached those covenants, Mr. Hayes." Conrad began to sweat. The expensive Brioni suit suddenly looked too big for him. "Now wait a minute, Miss Fisher. Let's be reasonable. We can negotiate." "There is no negotiation." Abigail cut him off, her tone like absolute zero. "A notice of default was electronically filed 10 minutes ago. First Liberty Continental is officially calling in all of your loans, every single one. You have 30 days to produce $480 million in liquid capital, or we will seize your assets, starting with the Hudson Yards project and ending with this restaurant." Conrad stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His empire, built on intimidation and borrowed money, was crumbling in front of an audience of his peers. He hadn't just bought a restaurant. He had handed the detonator of his financial ruin to the very woman he tried to humiliate. "So, Mr. Hayes," Abigail said softly, turning her back on him and walking toward the staff entrance. She paused and looked over her shoulder. "Enjoy your restaurant. You have exactly 1 month until I repossess it." The morning after the catastrophic confrontation at L'Orchidée, the upper echelons of the Manhattan financial district were already buzzing with vicious whispers. Blood was in the water, and Wall Street sharks have an unparalleled sense of smell. Inside the sterile glass-walled conference room of Skadden, Arps, Slate, Megger and Flom, one of the city's most ruthless corporate law firms, Conrad Hayes looked as though he had aged a decade overnight. His lead attorney, Gregory Pierce, a man usually known for his unshakable demeanor, sat at the head of the mahogany table rubbing his temples. Spread out before them were hundreds of pages of loan agreements, covenants, and breach notices from First Liberty Continental Bank. "I need a solution, Gregory," Conrad demanded, his voice, devoid of its usual booming arrogance, replaced instead by a ragged desperation. "I need an injunction. Block the default notice. Claim the covenant breach was a clerical error. Do whatever it is you charge me $2,000 an hour to do." Gregory sighed, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Conrad, you don't seem to grasp the gravity of the situation. This isn't a clerical error. You established a shell company to quickly route $12.5 million to buy a restaurant out of spite. You didn't run it through compliance. You didn't notify the primary lien holder, which happens to be the very institution funding your multi-billion-dollar Hudson Yards development. Abigail Fisher has you dead to rights. She's a 20-something girl playing dress-up with her grandfather's money," Conrad shouted, slamming his fist onto the table. "Call Goldman Sachs. Call the Carlyle Group. We refinance. We buy out First Liberty's position, and we crush her." "I have been on the phone since 6 a.m., Gregory replied coldly, entirely unfazed by the outburst. "Goldman passed. Carlyle passed. The banking world is a very small, very exclusive club, Conrad. Theodore Fisher was a legend, and his granddaughter has just signaled to the entire market that she is just as ruthless. No one is going to step in front of a moving freight train to save a heavily leveraged developer who defaults on loans over a bruised ego." The reality of his isolation began to suffocate Conrad. He had spent his entire career bullying contractors, hostile taking over weaker firms and making powerful enemies. Now entirely exposed, he found that not a single hand was reaching out to pull him from the wreckage. Across the city, high above the chaotic streets in the penthouse offices of First Liberty Continental, Abigail Fisher sat behind a massive desk carved from solid reclaimed oak. She wore a tailored navy pinstripe suit, her demeanor a stark contrast to the quiet waitress folding napkins just 48 hours prior. Standing across from her was Richard Montgomery, the bank's veteran chief operating officer. "Hayes is panicking," Richard reported, sliding a leather-bound portfolio across the desk. "He's trying to liquidate his personal assets. He just quietly listed the Hamptons estate in Southampton and the Bombardier Global 7,500 private jet. He's looking for fast liquidity to cover the immediate penalty fees and stave off the asset seizure." Abigail didn't even open the portfolio. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes sharp and calculating. "The Hamptons estate is cross-collateralized against his commercial mezzanine debt, Richard. Is it not?" "It is." Richard smirked slightly. "And the jet is leased through a subsidiary that we also finance." "Excellent. Freeze them both. Draft an injunction blocking the sale of any asset tied to our underlying collateral." Abigail instructed, her voice crisp and emotionless. "He doesn't get to sell off the furniture to save the burning house. What about the London investors?" Richard's smile widened. "Alistair Hughes and the Kensington Group. They were already hesitant after the display Hayes put on at the restaurant. When news of the default hit Bloomberg this morning, Hughes completely pulled out of the Hudson Yards residential tower deal. "Call Mr. Hughes directly," Abigail said smoothly. "Inform him that First Liberty Continental will be acquiring the Hudson Yards development through foreclosure in 28 days. Tell him we would love to bring the Kensington Group in as premier equity partners once the toxic management has been excised." Richard nodded, a deep sense of respect settling over him for the young chairwoman. "You are boxing him in completely, Abigail. You aren't leaving him a single exit. Conrad Hayes builds his wealth by exploiting the vulnerable Richard. He ruins lives for sport." Abigail replied, turning her gaze to the sprawling New York skyline outside her window. "I am simply demonstrating what happens when the rabbit he tries to crush happens to own the snare." Over the next 3 weeks, Conrad's empire unraveled with terrifying speed. Without the London investors, his construction sites ground to a halt. Unpaid contractors walked off the job, leaving skeletal steel towers looming over the city like monuments to his hubris. The financial press had a field day, dubbing the fiasco the billion-dollar busboy blunder. In a final desperate twist, Conrad believed he had found a secret lifeline. On day 26 of his 30-day grace period, he secured a clandestine meeting with a mid-tier private equity firm out of Chicago, the Belmont Group. They specialized in distressed assets and offered him a predatory but viable bailout loan. It would strip him of 70% of his equity, but it would save him from total bankruptcy. Conrad arrived at the Belmont Group's temporary Manhattan office, a thin sheen of nervous sweat coating his forehead. He was ready to sign anything. The managing partner slid the thick contract across the table. Conrad grabbed the Mont Blanc pen, his hand shaking, ready to sign away his majority control just to survive. Suddenly, the office door clicked open. Abigail Fisher walked into the room, flanked by Richard Montgomery and 2 corporate security officers. Conrad froze the pen, hovering a millimeter above the signature line. "What are you doing here? This is a private meeting." The Belmont managing partner looked down at the table, refusing to meet Conrad's eyes. He quietly pulled the contract back across the desk. "I apologize, Mr. Hayes," Abigail said, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. "But it seems your due diligence team is as incompetent as your etiquette. The Belmont Group was acquired by a subsidiary holding company 3 days ago." She stepped forward, placing her hands flat on the table, leaning in close so Conrad could see the absolute finality in her eyes. "A holding company entirely owned by First Liberty Continental. I own this firm, Conrad. There is no bailout. There is no secret exit. The game is over." The pen slipped from Conrad's fingers, clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. The 30th day did not arrive with a dramatic clash of thunder or a sudden explosion, but rather with the cold, sterile, and terrifying efficiency of corporate execution. Beneath a heavy, oppressive, grey, overcast sky, the legal machinery of First Liberty Continental was set into motion at exactly 9 a.m. There were no extensions granted and no last-minute phone calls answered. Receivers appointed by the bank, flanked by armed security, walked into the glittering glass lobby of Hayes International's corporate headquarters. By noon, the locks on the executive suites were changed. By 2 o'clock, the company was officially placed into receivership, its accounts frozen and drained to satisfy the suffocating mountain of defaulted mezzanine debt. Conrad Hayes, a man who only weeks prior had boasted his net worth in the billions, to anyone who would listen, was systematically erased from the Manhattan skyline. He was left with absolutely nothing but his primary residence, a sprawling, heavily mortgaged estate that suddenly felt like a mausoleum, and a stack of insurmountable legal bills he had no earthly way to pay. His phone, which used to ring incessantly with the groveling voices of politicians and contractors, had gone utterly silent. The sheer velocity of his ruin left him entirely hollowed out. At 7 p.m. that evening, a steady, chilling rain began to wash over the city streets. Inside Lorchidee, however, the atmosphere could not have been more different. The ambient golden lighting still bathed the luxurious dining room, the crystal glassware still sparkled under the chandeliers, and the elite of Manhattan still murmured over plates of pan-seared scallops and truffled risotto. Yet the underlying energy of the establishment was fundamentally transformed. The oppressive, suffocating tension that had hung over the staff for the past month, the fear of a tyrant's erratic whims, was entirely gone. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany double doors at the front of the restaurant swung open, but there was no grand theatrical entrance this time. There were no cowering lawyers or nervous assistants flanking him. Conrad Hayes walked in, completely alone. He was not wearing his signature custom Brioni suit. Instead, he wore a rumpled, rain-soaked trench coat over a slightly faded sweater. His face was deeply lined and hollowed out, the arrogant, predatory fire in his eyes completely extinguished. He looked like a ghost, haunting the site of his own demise. He hadn't come to cause a scene or hurl threats. In his utterly ruined state, he simply needed to look upon the catalyst of his destruction one last time. He found her sitting at a quiet, secluded corner table near the back of the room. Abigail Fisher wasn't wearing the black uniform apron of the waitstaff. She was dressed in a stunning, understated charcoal evening gown, quietly reviewing a leather-bound wine list. Sitting directly across from her, laughing brightly over a glass of sparkling water and a plate of prime rib, was Tommy, the 19-year-old busboy, whose nervous, shaking hands had accidentally started the entire catastrophic domino effect. Henri, the general manager, instantly spotted the intruder. His posture impeccable, his chin held high with a newfound authority, Henri intercepted Conrad before he could take more than 3 steps into the dining room. "Mr. Hayes," Henri said, his voice meticulously polite, but laced with an unshakable firmness. "Do you have a reservation with us this evening?" Conrad ignored the manager entirely, his bloodshot eyes locked squarely on Abigail. She noticed the sudden shift in the room's energy, calmly excused herself to a wide-eyed Tommy, and walked gracefully over to the foyer, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. "Ms. Fisher," Conrad croaked, his voice raspy and broken, completely stripped of its booming bass. "You actually did it. You took it all. The commercial towers, the holding companies, my legacy. You burned everything to the ground." "I didn't burn anything, Mr. Hayes." Abigail corrected him gently, her expression completely devoid of malice, which somehow made the reality sting even more. "I foreclosed on legally binding debts that you willingly chose to default on. I merely executed the precise terms of the contracts you signed with my institution." Conrad looked around the bustling, joyous restaurant, the very place he had spitefully and recklessly purchased with borrowed money just to publicly fire her. "And what about this place? What happens to the restaurant now? Do you sell it to the highest bidder to recoup your petty cash? Tear it down for a parking garage?" "No." Abigail smiled, a genuine warm expression that Conrad had never once seen directed at him. "I am a banker, Mr. Hayes, not a restaurateur. I have absolutely no business running Lorchidee." She gestured gracefully toward Henri, who was standing tall beside her. "This afternoon, First Liberty Continental legally transferred the deed and the full ownership of this establishment into a newly formed corporate trust. Henri is now the majority owner and the chief operating partner. The remaining equity has been carefully divided and distributed as stock options to the people who actually make this place remarkable, from the executive head chef to the line cooks all the way down to Tommy the busboy." Conrad stared at her, his jaw slack, genuinely stunned. "You gave a $12 million asset to the staff." They are the ones who built its value day in and day out, Abigail said smoothly, her voice ringing with finality. Unlike you, they understand that true sustainable wealth is built on mutual respect, diligence, and protecting the people who work for you. You genuinely believed that having money gave you the divine right to treat human beings like dirt on the bottom of your shoe. You learned quite expensively that you were wrong. Conrad opened his mouth to speak. Perhaps he wanted to hurl one final desperate insult, or perhaps he wanted to beg for a fraction of his life back. But as he looked at the untouchable poise of Abigail, the proud, unyielding stance of Henri, and the bustling, happy dining room that now belonged entirely to the working people he had so deeply despised, the words died silently in his throat. He had absolutely zero power left in this room or in this city. "All right," Abigail said softly, not taking her eyes off the broken man before her. "I believe Mr. Hayes is quite ready to leave now. Please show him the door." "With the utmost pleasure, madame," Henri replied smoothly. He stepped forward, opening the heavy mahogany door, letting the cold, biting wind of the rainy Manhattan night sweep into the foyer. "Good evening, Mr. Hayes. And please, for your own sake, do not ever return to my restaurant." Conrad Hayes slowly pulled his damp collar up against the biting chill and stepped backward out into the pouring rain. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him with an absolute, undeniable finality, locking him out of the world he used to rule. Inside, the profound warmth of l'orchidée carried on the musical clinking of glasses, ringing out like a quiet, beautiful celebration of ultimate justice served. Abigail Fisher turned away from the door, returned to her corner table, and prepared to enjoy a magnificent dinner she had well and truly earned. Did Abigail's ruthless brilliance leave you speechless? Power is nothing without respect, and this billionaire learned the hardest lesson of his life. If you loved this story of ultimate karma and financial revenge, smash that like button right now. Share this video with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible jaw-dropping real-life dramas every single week.